At the beginning of this month, Paul Dacre stepped down as the editor of the Daily Mail to be replaced by Geordie Greig, who has been described as pro EU. That's significant, of course, because for many years the Daily Mail has been very vocally anti EU. So far, I haven't seen any indication that the editorial stance is changing, particularly because it's still very much anti EU headlines. But that's not the main thing I want to talk about. I want to talk about Paul Dacre's legacy. I'd intended to do this actually at the time of his resignation, but other things came up. So he edited the Daily Mail from 1992 to 2018, earlier this month, which is a pretty long duration. And it's fair to say is one of the best known and most controversial press barons in this country. Um, and I do call him a press baron because I think his influence went well beyond just being an editor. Um, to me, I won't lie, I am not a fan of the Daily Mail. In fact, I find it gives me a rather bad taste in my stomach. I don't like it. I think it's a pretty hard right, blowhard tabloid. I do not like it. I'm going to be quite honest about that. But I want to be fair, so let me get that out of the way. Not absolutely everything Paul Dacre done was bad. His During his tenure, the Daily Mail campaigned hard for justice for Stephen Lawrence and to bring the killers of Stephen Lawrence to trial. So I suppose his defenders would use that to deflect criticism that he's a racist. You know, if he's trying to bring justice to the murders of a young black man. Another campaign that I think can be commended is their work to get recognition for the Afghan interpreters, people who risked their lives to interpret for the British Army in Afghanistan. And a few weeks ago, that campaign was seen as successful when those interpreters were granted asylum in the UK, as they should have. And that was a Daily Mail led campaign, so I give them credit for that. I think newspapers we all probably have our preferences and our um, views on particular newspapers. Any of us who follow, political discourse, I certainly do. I'm very opinionated when it comes to the editorial stance of national newspapers, but that doesn't mean I absolutely disagree with absolutely everything that is printed. So I'm sure you can find things that the Daily Mail has reported that can be said to be, well, that's important. That was other papers aren't talking about it. That was necessary, etc. And I will say the Daily Mail will cover things and has covered things that other papers are frankly too politically correct about. Okay, that's something that I recognize. But, and this is a big but, and this to me is a damning indictment of Paul Dacre. What you had with the Daily Mail, especially in his tenure, was these headlines that were played judge, jury, and executioner, and they would have big glaring headlines, like literally, the font size was actually bigger than any other newspaper, um, where they would pass an enormous amount of judgment and pontificate an enormous amount of opinion on a particular subject. Um, and then immediately hide behind the press freedom argument when they were challenged. Now, I have a big problem with that sort of tactic because I think it is like a playground bully who pushes his or her way around, but then can't handle it when the tide turns on them, when someone stands up to them. That's very much how I see the Daily Mail. An example of this was the recent exchange he had with Richard Branson and Virgin Trains. Basically, Dacre was demanding that Virgin Trains stock the Daily Mail. And Daily Mail supporters, I thought, acted a bit out of context there because what they were saying, oh, this is Richard Branson telling people what they can and can't read. No, he was just saying we're not going to stock this on our trains. It didn't say, and this is an aspect of that case that really irritated me. People thought it was Branson banning the Daily Mail. He was just saying it wasn't going to be sold on his trains. Um, it didn't stop people buying the Daily Mail at the train station and bringing it on board. And that's their property. He wouldn't have a right to take it away from them. But surely a CEO has the right to determine what is sold on their enterprise. Um, so I think that's something the Dacre apologists overlooked. And to me, that was a very clear example of Paul Dacre pushing his way around. It's something that he always done during his editorship. He pushed his way around Fleet Street, and in that sense, he was very much the archetype of an arrogant tabloid editor who felt they could do whatever they want. That's honestly how I saw his personality, and I've no respect for him from that point of view. The Daily Mail would come out with very inflammatory headlines, and Lord Adonis was debating with this with I forget who the guy was. I think it was Peter Orr, someone that I can't remember exactly. But Lord Adonis made the good point that the Daily Mail often made headlines that were basically hate mongering, and I don't think anyone, obviously, if you're of a right wing persuasion, you're going to disagree with this. But when you had headlines talking in such a sweeping manner, in such a generalizing way about migrants, about the unemployed, um, I feel that has real world consequences. I do feel that what the national press, what newspapers publish, has an influence on how people think. And you'd be very gullible if you didn't recognize the power that newspapers in this country have, much more so than other countries. I would suggest the print press in this country has the power to make and break governments. So when he was coming out with headlines, let me give an example. He would take a case of extreme welfare abuse, right? I don't know, maybe a father or a man who'd been with nine different women and had 20 different children and was claiming thousands of benefits. And he would present that as being the same for every claimant. Like they're taking your money and it was a very nasty and toxic way he would have of trying to turn the majority against a minority. And I thought that was utterly despicable. He'd done the same with migrants. Like they're coming in their thousands, and he dehumanized people. He dehumanized migrants. He dehumanized the unemployed, and I thought that was disgusting. But another issue I took with Paul Dacre and take with Paul Dacre is that whilst he comes out with all these pontificating headlines, and remember the editor has a final say, so I say him because it is his final say what goes on the cover. He never showed his face in public, or very, very rarely. He rarely done interviews. He rarely, if ever, appeared on Question Time. He never put himself up for scrutiny. Yet he would feel nothing wrong with judging politicians or judging other public figures or demonizing people who cannot defend themselves. I mean, do you think it's a level playing field? An unemployed claimant or a migrant versus a powerful media editor? It's hardly a level playing field. So I think Paul Dacre is basically a card in the sense that he will not allow himself to be scrutinized. And whenever anyone challenged him, he would hide behind the press freedom argument. So not everything he done was bad. Yes, he acted, he worked hard on the Stephen Lawrence thing and the Afghan interpreters, and I'm sure you could find other campaigns that the Daily Mail was involved in. But to me, it's not an excuse and it's not a caveat for the way they scapegoated and demonized millions of people. And I think that was utterly disgusting. I'm not talking about being politically correct and just, saying being ultra polite. I get it. Papers have opinions, but it was the way the Daily Mail went about it I thought was totally despicable. And the way that Dacre would hide. I mean, if he at least had the guts to sort of come up on Question Time and defend his headlines, he'd deserve a little bit more respect. But because he wouldn't do that, I think the man is a card. Alistair Campbell made that point, and Alistair Campbell himself is a controversial figure. He's a former tabloid man. He knows the industry, but he made that point, and I think he was right. Paul Dacre is a moral card. He can give, but he can't take, and that's the typical dynamic of a bully. So that's why I have no respect for Paul Dacre. I'm sure he won lots of awards within the industry. Incredibly, I just found out actually he was a member of the Press Complaints Commission until that became defunct and became the Independent Press Complaints Commission, I believe it's now called. Um, in my opinion, tabloid editors should have no position in an independent press complaints commission. It should be truly independent because letting them, have influence in it is basically like in the fox guard the chickens. You know, these people have a vested interest, and they're never going to take accountability for what they do. In my opinion, they will always hide behind the press freedom argument. To be clear, I do, of course, support press freedom. I would never ever want a situation where we are like China and newspapers can't question elected officials. But Paul Dacre is a living embodiment of tabloid arrogance, someone who thought he could say and do whatever he wanted pretty much. And as soon as anyone questioned him, where was he? When did he ever face public scrutiny? That's what I find utterly despicable about the man. So, from that point of view, he was utterly unaccountable. We talk about politicians being accountable, but what about tabloid editors? They're just as powerful. In fact, they're more powerful than most politicians. So why shouldn't they be accountable? That's something I would like to see change in this country. I want to see tabloid editors personally come under a lot more scrutiny. And so I think the Independent Press Complaints Commission should have a lot more power. Um, I'm not saying it should be composed of politicians. Obviously, there would be bias there, but it should be composed of um, industry analysts, maybe judges, just people who would be genuine third party, who wouldn't have a vested interest, who aren't party politically affiliated. Um, so that's my view on Paul Dacre and his role in the Daily Mail. Yes, he achieved some things. He was certainly one of the country's longest serving editors. I'm sure he was smart. I'm sure he was capable of what he'd done. But that's not exactly an endearment. That's, to me, only makes him all the more Machiavellian. Um, I have no respect for the way that he would, put out these inflammatory, hate filled headlines. And yes, it is hate filled to demonize millions of migrants or millions of unemployed. It's not a case of him saying we're just talking about, people who are either abusing the system or they are not integrating. He was demonizing everybody. That's the difference. And that I think was disgusting and shameful and cowardly. Shame on you, Paul Dacre. So that's my view. Let me know your thoughts.